Samurai Jack, created by Genndy Tartakovsky, aired its first season through the end of 2001. In this video, I'll review each episode, give it a score, and then talk about the season in general at the end. Also, I'm following the production order instead of the airing order, but that doesn't really matter with this season. Anyway, without any further ado, every episode of Samurai Jack, Season 1, reviewed. Episode 1, The Beginning. When the ancient evil Aku returns to terrorize Japan, the Emperor's young son is sent to distant lands to train in the ways of the warrior. When the series first came out, the first 3 episodes were aired back to back to back, and together they make up the Samurai Jack premiere movie. This explains the first half or so of this episode, which definitely feels like an introduction to a larger story. Aku's introduction comes after a long and cinematic opening, and the payoff to it is fantastic. Aku completely overpowering everything that's thrown at him makes for a great scene, and a great transition into the prince's training sequence. These few scenes should by any measure be boring, but instead it's just so interesting. Going from land to land, watching the prince learn different fighting styles against great backgrounds with fantastic animation is just very entertaining. Once the training sequence is over, the prince finally gets the sword that we saw at the beginning. There's not much to say about the scene in the temple with his mother, besides it is the first instance of the show-long trend of playing around with the aspect ratio, which I'll talk about more in my season overview. The first few scenes in Aku's mines do a fantastic job in showing just how abused the people of Jack's kingdom were. The first proper fight in the series, Jack vs. Aku's minions, does not disappoint. As from Jack's awesome grab of the whip to defeating the last minion, the fight just shows the pure brutality of Jack. The spirits outside of Aku's tower make for some great visuals, but are only on screen for a few seconds before Jack faces Aku for the first time in the series. Aku going on this huge spiel about no mortal being able to hurt him before being attacked by Jack is funny, and is a great intro to a great fight. Aku's transformation makes the fight so dynamic, and despite being a generally slow fight, it never feels like it's dragging on and on. Anyway, the end of the fight is perfectly satisfying, with the sword being thrown up being innovated very well. Jack's arrogance to wait and listen to Aku's taunt leads to his downfall, as Aku is able to send Jack through a portal, which besides being a little bit awkward, is still animated fairly well. From a few great fights, to a fantastic backstory for the character we'll be following for 5 seasons, to beautiful backgrounds, this episode is one of the greatest PUDs I've ever seen, and sets up the series fantastically well. Episode 2, The Samurai Called Jack. Aku has transported his mortal samurai enemy into the far future in which Aku rules all. As the intro song spoils, Aku sends Jack into the future. After a curiously fantastic recap at the beginning of the episode, the first actual scene is still pretty good, but it does go on a little bit longer than it really needed to. While having Jack have to fight at the same time that he figures out where he is a cool idea, the sequence is a bit stiff. Anyway, unlike the last episode, which was practically comedy-free, this one starts immediately with the teens, who are a fantastic contrast to Jack. While they would have been annoying had they stuck around, they are on screen just long enough to be funny. After they give Jack his name, we get to the best fight of the episode. The bar is such a fantastic environment, with the pounding music and flashing colors looking and sounding fantastic. The fight itself is barely on screen, with a large amount of the time spent being focused on the dogs, but in the parts that we do get to see, it's a slow but elegant disarming. While yet this episode is really just the middle third of a movie, it's still weird that there are no fights in the last 10 minutes. Anyway, the next scene is a 5-minute conversation between the dogs and Jack, where Jack learns that Aku sent him into an Aku-controlled future. This conversation is honestly the first mediocre scene of the series, as the dog's delivery comes off as more annoying than charming, and there really isn't a visual component. This conversation makes up a fourth of the episode, and definitely feels like a bit of a time patter. Anyway, after Jack takes up his name, we get reintroduced to the ruler of the universe, Aku. While by the end of the season, Aku will get really goofy and be the main source of comedy for the season, in this episode, he really is portrayed as a ruthless villain. His interaction with the ocean aliens really shows his cruel demeanor, along with his reaction to the prince's return. Back to the prince, Jack discovering the dogs working as slaves just like his people did is a great scene, and the cliffhanger at the end leads well into the next episode. Overall, this episode definitely is a bit slower than the first and has its problems, but it's still a pretty good follow-up. Episode 3, The First Fight. Aku's destroyer beetle drones are closing in on Samurai Jack and his pack of archaeologist dogs, therefore Jack decides to use anything and everything in hand to defend themselves. While it's certainly a stretch, you can argue that this episode only consists of 2 scenes, the fight and the preparation of. The first half of this episode, which is really closer to the first third, consists of Jack training the dogs and preparing his armor and traps for the fight. While the scene isn't really exciting to watch and is at times boring, it has some nice moments, and it makes watching the actual fight extremely satisfying. I especially like the taming of the creature factor in the creation of the flag. With that out of the way, let's talk about the longest fight scene I've ever reviewed. The first part of the fight is not only dialogueless, but also musicless, meaning all we hear is sound effects. This part of the fight is the payoff for the preparation, as nearly everything from the previous scene is used in this fight. The cannons, the exploding barrels, and the arrows made from crystals all make for fantastically animated demolition. Jack and his steed just completely thrashing the drones is done incredibly well. The final scene of this segment is just that, with Jack taking out large amount of beetles with fantastic fight choreography before his steed bails and he gets pinned to the ground. This part of the fight is generally the weakest part of the episode, as it pretty much just consists of Jack running and the beetles being defeated in increasingly dumb ways. Like, going from Jack killing them mid-air with a spear to having like 100 of them fall into a spike pit is a bit disappointing, especially considering they're giving human attributes of thought towards the end of the episode. Anyway, speaking of the end of the episode, it's not only the highlight of the fight, but also the highlight of the entire premiere movie. Jack ceases running from the creatures and instead decides to face Aku's drone head-on. The drones surround Jack, which gives the animation team an opportunity to expertly show just how doomed Jack really is. The shot showing the number of drones is fantastic, and Jack cutting off parts of his clothes to show how damaged he is really shows how desperate this last attempt is. The show then goes into slow motion, which while the animation is a bit rough, it allows for Jack to savagely slice up the remaining beetles. The choreography of Jack dodging the drone's attacks and being covered in oil is fantastic, and leads to a truly incredible sequence. After Jack is covered in the oil of his fellow drones, the remaining drones move to flee, and that's when Jack speaks for the first time during the fight.
No. There is no escape.
Jack chasing down the fleeing beetles and then holding up the flag is a fantastic end to the episode. The black of the oil against the orange background looks great, and the music fits it pretty well. The ending is pretty good as it sets up the rest of the series, with Jack setting off to defeat Aku, and Aku monologuing about the samurai. Overall, this episode is pretty great. While it does get a little bit boring at times, the vast majority of this episode is filled with great action, an ending that is truly fantastic, and most of the little things throughout the fight that add so much. Episode 4, Jack, the Woolies, and the Chritchellites. While hunting for food, Jack helps the tiny Chritchellites recapture an escaped Woolie. This episode is the first of the series to not feature Aku, something that only happens 4 times this season. Instead, the adventure follows the second kind of episode. Jack gets caught up in something and decides to help. The episode begins with Jack attempting to catch a meal, which definitely helps remind the audience that Jack is still a human, despite the fact that his adventure is trying to travel back in time to fight a shape-shifting, wisecracking dimensional demon. The capture of the Woolie is fairly average animation-wise, but Tom Kinney does a fantastic job in portraying every single Chritchelite. The voice he does for them, in addition to the animation, makes them incredibly hateable, and keeps you just waiting for Jack to take them down. Jack becoming more and more skeptical of the aliens before eventually realizing their malicious actions is done fairly well, and their abuse towards the Woolies is not censored nor downplayed at all. The dream sequence is the highlight of the episode for me, just every part of it is fantastic. To begin, the music is this creepy electronic music that really sets the tone for the reveal at the end. The colors of red and purple contrasted with the black background look great, and the crisp action sequence fit the sharp color contrast throughout. The ending is probably the weakest part of the scene, but it still looks great. Anyway, back to the real world, this is where the episode kind of starts to fall apart. The Elder is just really boring, and the story boils down to, they have orb and that sucks. Obviously, the whole episode is an allegory, which is fairly easy since the episode is literally about one race of people using technology to enslave another group because they believe that they're superior, but the goofy demeanor of the Woolies kind of undermines it. I mean, the fight itself was already weak, but the whole episode literally ends when Jack pokes the Woolie from behind and it flies up and lands on the orb. The end of the episode is weird too, as the Elder just sends Jack into the wilderness with no real clue where he's going. Overall, this episode is a good first half and a weak second half. While doing a story like this has the potential to be great, the show doesn't really take itself seriously enough, and doing it in the 4th episode was perhaps a bit too early. Episode 5, Jack in Space. Samurai Jack hooks up with a group of scientists who are secretly building a rocket to escape Aku's service. The beginning of this episode shares a lot with the last one, as it is once again a nice calm opener with Jack in the wilderness with an animal, but this time is a little bit less of a hunting situation. The first fight against the Mantoids is pretty well choreographed, with each movement from Jack having a purpose and showing his fighting style very well. The reactions and movements from the astronauts after the Mantoid announces their sins is quite humorous too. Speaking of the scientists, they're kinda hit or miss this episode. Some of the time they're really funny, like Frederick, but other times they're extremely frustrating, like every time that Sir J says some kind of odds. These odds obviously aren't accurate, so the joke being repeated 1,000 times has no sort of depth. Anyway, once again we get another preparation sequence with Jack training to become an astronaut. Not much to say about this scene, besides that they completely nail the reveal of Jack in the spacesuit. Jack just pressing a button randomly is a bit out of character for the stoic samurai, but it makes for a comedic and visually pleasing scene, so it was probably worth it. This is gonna sound weird, but Jack's story is my favorite part of the episode. Just Jack's completely serious monologue about his lifelong goal being interrupted by elevator music and nonchalant scientists is really funny. The rest of the episode just consists of Jack fighting in space, which ranges from slightly clever to really boring. The fight gets worse as it goes on, as it's clear that Jack won't get to go back in time, so it's really just waiting for him to get caught up in something else. The fight is surprisingly stagnant and basic for a fight in space, and the robots all look about the same. Jack leaving his pod to stop the gun is such a cop-out, and the scientist just leaving without any kind of thanks or anything is just really weird writing. At least the end sequence is really cool, with Jack flying back to Earth before walking into the distance being an incredibly cinematic scene. This episode is the first in the series to lean so heavily on comedy, and while it does occasionally work, it still feels slow and lackluster at times. Overall, while not a terrible episode, it just feels mediocre or worse throughout large chunks. Episode 6, Jack and the Warrior Woman. Jack is aided by an equally skilled warrior woman with a dark secret to search for the crystal with magical properties. After Jack goes through the town, which is a great introduction to a place we spend about 37 seconds in, Jack enters a shop, which is one of the funniest scenes so far. The shopkeeper going on a tangent about how they're like Jack's mother, as they know exactly what he seeks before cutting comedically to a rug, is hilarious, and the insinuation that Jack should have mentioned the Woolies before is also a great joke. Also, just a quick aside, but Cartoon Network aired this episode 11 out of 13, which makes it seem like Jack is traveling to the shopkeeper pretty much the entire season. I don't know if this was done on purpose to make the show seem like it's more of a journey, but it's weird unintended. Moving on, the scene with the hologram that leads into the fight is all written very well, and it's a nice blend of comedy, action, and foreshadowing. The clues are there from the beginning that Ikra is actually Aku, but it's not so obvious that you're just waiting for a reveal. While hiding that Ikra was evil in general would have been nice, they go a bit overboard with directly showing that she's at least not what she seems. It's still a pretty good twist. Anyway, the fight itself is fairly basic by the show standards, so let's move on to the journey. First off, Ikra's story told through fire is a very clever method of flashback, although Jack's monologue about defeating Aku was a bit much for his stoic character. The travel montage is one of the best scenes of the show so far, if you can ignore a few plot holes. To start with the positives, a few fight scenes in it are well animated, the music is fantastic from start to finish, and the clues to Aku's identity are fantastic nods that are really only understandable in rewatches. The plot hole of Ikra not just letting Jack die, even though she had ample opportunities to, can kind of be answered by Aku just wanting to play around with Jack, but a few episodes later he sends multiple people with the full intention of killing him, so it doesn't really make sense. Once reaching the Oasis, the episode's reveal of the true Ikra is handled pretty well, from the group failing the test of pure heart, to her shape-shifting, to the transition in Mako's voice. Ikra shattering the gem while Jack watches in horror is great, and him angrily striking the ground ends the episode fantastically. One benefit of the production order is that this episode, along with the next two, kind of create a mid-season saga, but I'll talk about that more in episode 8's review. As for this episode, it's pretty good. The lack of a truly great fight, along with some nitpicks, keeps it from being truly fantastic, but the atmosphere and writing is incredible at times, and the episode's somber ending ends the episode on a great note. Episode 7, Jack and the Three Blind Archers. Jack learns about a wishing well of King Osric on top of a tower protected by 3 unbeatable archers and vows to make his way past them. This episode of Samurai Jack doesn't actually feature the title Samurai until about 7 minutes in. Instead, we get the first of many great scenes from this episode, with the annihilation of the Vikings' army making for a terrific introduction to the archers themselves. While the title of the episode gives away the twist, the hints of them being blind are fantastic throughout, from literal clues like the robot being shot after making noise to more metaphorical hints like Jack's eyes being covered for a large portion of the episode. Back to the over 5-minute introduction shot, the incredible display of power from the archers really hypes up their interaction with Jack later in the episode, and the segue into the Viking telling a story before cutting to a stoic Jack makes the beginning of this episode truly fantastic. The episode doesn't falter from here, as Jack's parting message to the Viking is just a great use of the show's limited dialogue.
There are other ways to get home.
Not for me.
Speaking of the show's limit of dialogue, after Jack leaves the boat, besides a few key moments in the end, there is no dialogue in this episode. Jack doesn't monologue about his discoveries, but instead, his thoughts are portrayed expertly through his actions. Jack's slow walk through the forest before discovering the carnage is extremely atmospheric, and makes the eventual payoff of the archers firing at Jack 11 minutes in feel extremely satisfying. Before getting to his encounters with the title archers, I first want to mention the music of this episode, which is nothing short of immaculate. Besides one silent scene later in the episode, which I'll get to later, the entire episode utilizes music to cover the lack of dialogue. And here is just a genre-blending masterpiece of ambient and more action-focused pieces. My favorite track of the episode has to be when Jack discovers the carnage, but the entire episode is scored extremely well. Anyway, back to Jack and the archers. Jack's discovery that their blind is done well, with him first charging in before slowly realizing the true nature of his enemy. The next few scenes are Jack preparing for his fight by first meditating and reflecting on his past training. The reason this works so well is that we saw Jack travel around the world learning different fighting styles, so this isn't just out of nowhere. While Jack deciding to blindfold himself to find their level isn't exactly unique, what is unique is the next scene, which can only be described as one of the most creative uses of animation I've ever seen. When Jack puts on his blindfold, the audience is also blinded and can only see what's heard. The animals and other moving objects being shown against a black background look completely fantastic, and the complete silence besides the ambient noises makes for a great look into what Jack is hearing and seeing. Despite the action actually being shown, this episode gives incredible context to both Jack while blindfolded and the blind archers. If it seems like I'm just going through each scene and telling you why it's fantastic, that's because this episode is just consistently immaculate. And to top it all off, I honestly think that the last scene is the best one of the entire 22 minutes. After Jack declares that he's ready, we get what looks to be a rehash when he charged in earlier, but instead, this time Jack is now listening to his surroundings and is moving accordingly. The animation to show how Jack is now acting differently from his previous encounter is incredibly clever and well done, and the scene is exactly as long as it needs to be. I didn't mention it before, but the design of the archers both emphasizes their reliance on sound and allows for them to be very expressive in this silent episode. Jack's silhouette in the moon before landing on the castle is just epic, and his Neo-like dodging of the arrow makes for a fantastic ending to the short action portion of the episode. The reveal that the archers are actual humans, or at least human-like, is the perfect reveal, and foreshadows the true nature of the well. The archer's story of being tricked by the well leads well into not just the best shot of the episode, but as the season as a whole, as Jack's anger is portrayed extremely well. His anger slowly builds up as he shakes from rage, realizing what he must do and that his journey is not over. The payoff of Jack striking his sword into the well and wishing it out of existence is written supremely well, and the voice acting from Phil Lamar to put that much emotion into it makes the scene that much better. The animation of the well being destroyed looks beautiful, and the episode ends on a somber note with Jack walking into the distance, similar to the last episode. As you can probably tell, this episode is a masterpiece of animation. Jack's journey in this episode is told extremely well, and the episode never falters for even a scene throughout all 22 minutes. Despite having little dialogue besides the beginning and end, it's clear what every character is thinking throughout the entire episode. The settings look great, each scene is something innovative, the music is fantastic. I could really go on and on for the rest of this video just about this episode, but I think it's fairly clear what my general thoughts on this episode are after over 1,000 words. Usually this would be the part of the review where I say the few things I disliked about the episode, but I couldn't even find a nitpick to complain about. This episode is one of the easiest things I've ever reviewed to recommend, and is truly the perfection of not just all things Samurai Jack, but of all things animation. Episode 8, Jack vs. Mad Jack. Despite having a reward of 2 Googleplex on his head, no bounty hunter has been able to defeat Samurai Jack. Therefore, Aku creates an evenly matched mirror image of Jack to battle him. While I'm not entirely sure that's intentional, the trilogy set up by this episode and the last 2 is a nice mid-season arc. Each of the last 2 episodes ends with Jack enraged, and this one deals with him trying to dispose of that anger. It's a nice continuity that was broken up by Cartoon Network's decision to mess up the airing order. Anyway, into the actual episode, the intro scene is a classic Samurai Jack alien bar setup shot. Nothing really special going on here. Jack beating up the bounty hunters before Mad Jack features both great fights and is arguably one of the funniest sequences of the season. Each creature just screeching his name before being obliterated by the samurai is incredibly comedic. The fights themselves are great too, with well-designed enemies and interesting fighting styles. However, the most important and arguably most impressive part of this scene is the buildup of Jack's anger. Seeing the usually poised Jack get genuinely enraged is so well developed, as he is harassed constantly through the first 10 minutes of the episode. Aku's appearance in this episode is one of his least developed of the season. He gives a typical villain plan announcement and then dips the rest of the episode. However, he is responsible for a great foil to Jack in the latter half of this episode, Mad Jack. After a fantastic scene with Jack finally snapping after his shoe breaks, we get introduced to the samurai's evil counterpart. Besides just having a visually pleasing design, his fight with Jack is pretty solid. solid. The first part is pretty repetitive with them just trading blows. I get the whole point of this segment is just how to show they're similar in fighting styles and abilities, but I feel like this is done way better in the next part. The background slowly burning just looks awesome as a background for the fight, but also serves a different purpose. Throughout the fight, the show changes the color scheme to show how Jack is just like Mad Jack, as they look identical during these scenes. This is just a beautiful use of animation and makes for some great shots. The highlight of the episode is when Jack realizes this when he looks into his sword and sees what he's become. This shot just looks really nice and feeds well into the next scene, which while being probably a bit longer than it needs to, shows the fire in Jack slowly burn out. The comedic-ish ending of the episode with him continuously cutting to Jack being calm is a bit out of nowhere, but him conquering his inner demons to defeat his outer demons is a satisfying ending. Overall, this episode is great. While it does have a few issues with pacing and repetitiveness, the ending fight with Mad Jack is especially solid for how long it is, and the build-up to that fight is also well done. Episode 9, Jack Under the Sea. Samurai Jack ventures into the deep end of the ocean after hearing of a time portal that can be found in Oceanus. Starting off very similarly to Jack and the Three Blind Archers, this one also started with Jack hearing of a way back to his own time and him following that lead. The kind of back and forth nature of the cutting between the story of Oceanus while Jack searches for it starts the episode with a pretty decent opener, although it's nothing new for the series. Seeing Jack just carelessly almost get killed is a bit ridiculous, and is yet another case of Aku not just killing Jack when he had the chance. The Triceratops knew that the goal was to kill Jack, and yet they still send a jelly will to save him from definitely drowning. Anyway, the sequence before meeting the citizens of Oceanus looks nice and is creatively animated, but it drags on for a while. Having Jack underwater definitely wasn't utilized as well as I wanted it to be, as Jack spends most of the time of the episode in a bubble. Once you actually meet the Triceratops, they're kind of hit or miss. Their voices being impressions of British celebrities is funny at first, but besides that, they have no unique attributes at all. The episode just drags every time they're on screen. The dinner scene is arguably the most boring scene in the show so far. Them betraying Jack and then getting betrayed themselves is a bit interesting, as it gives the show an opportunity to have a fight without Jack present. Unfortunately, when you have a fight between two entities, one of which is invincible to everything, the fight just isn't that interesting. You just watch Aku curve stomp for 5 minutes until they eventually have the idea to save Jack, who just hits Aku once, and then once Aku is vulnerable, just leaves. The entire climax, just like the rest of the episode, is just dull. The ending at least isn't terrible, and does a decent job closing out the episode. Jack not getting upset is a great continuation from the last episode, and it shows how Jack has changed since defeating Mad Jack. Him only wanting sushi is also a nice comedic ending shot for the episode, as it shows a softer side to the typically stoic Jack. Overall, this episode, while not terrible, is just a lot of boring shots, and does very little that the show hasn't already done in its first 8 outings. Episode 10, Jack and the Lava Monster. Having made his way through a cave filled with booby traps, Samurai Jack faces a giant lava monster that used to be a Viking warrior in days long past. The beginning of this episode has very little to do with the rest of it, but it still looks completely fantastic. Seeing Jack freezing as he's taunted by a voice is great, and the lack of music helps out the scene a lot. The scene before Jack meets the monster, where he's descending into the cave and dodging booby traps, is a bit unnecessarily long. The show generally utilizes its 22 minutes pretty well, but here, as seen with other parts of the episode, the story struggles to fill the time. The actual booby traps are quite generic, and the Looney Tunes-esque gag is very out of place in one of the most serious episodes of the season. The episode definitely picks up once we get to the lava monster, though. The beginning of the fight before it gets interrupted is okay, but too short to be great. What is great is Jack's refusal to fight, and the story that comes after it is also pretty interesting. The episode raises a great moral dilemma, which is supported by the first 9 episodes of the show. The story itself is pretty average, but the art style is fantastic, and learning about how Aku has ravaged towns is more great world building. The last fight is a bit disappointing, as they go for a more musical and stylistic fight instead of a more typical one. While I get the appeal of having a more elaborate fight, swords hitting each other without any noise feels completely off. We don't even get to see the final blow of the fight, because for some reason the show decides to show the reactions instead. I would have preferred if they cut the first half of the fight out entirely, cut the booby trap and story portion in half, and then given us an epic 7-minute fight scene. I feel like that would have made for a better climax. While the beginning and end of the ending sequence was fantastic, I especially like Jack adding to the warrior's tablet, I really wish they hadn't have shown them taking the warrior to Valhalla. It doesn't really make sense for the rules of the show and is extensively corny. This episode is conceptually fantastic and has some truly great moments, but poorly manages its pacing and has a less than stellar fight. Episode 11, Jack and the Scotsman. Samurai Jack is crossing a seemingly endless rope bridge when he meets another wanted man coming from the other side, the Scotsman. I know this episode has been filled with cross-episode comparison, but the similarities between the opening of this episode and the one that preceded it are very prevalent. prevalent. Both feature Jack walking through beautiful backgrounds until he eventually gets to the location where most of the episode takes place. This is where the episode splits, as this one goes more towards comedy instead of the more serious tone of the last episode. This is mostly due to the namesake character of the episode, the Scotsman. John DiMaggio does a great job bringing the character to life, and his introduction with the bagpipes slowly getting louder is hilariously great. He's a perfect antithesis to Jack, and watching them stand face to face while he continuously gets the samurai more and more flustered is really funny, especially Jack bursting his bagpipes. Their fight is fine, it's not really anything special though. Because the bridge was so narrow, there really wasn't anything they could have done with it, so its short length is appreciated. Seeing that they are perfect matches for each other, at least in the narrow bridge setting, is done fairly well, as Jack just cutting the bridge is also climatically pretty good. Once in the swamp, the episode slows down a bit, and the dynamic between the Scotsman and Jack really starts to develop. Jack not completely stooping down to the Scotsman level was appreciated, as his smirks when he is proven correct is in line with his character. The setting for the final fight of the episode is a great background, and although I think that keeping them chained together could have led to a more interestingly choreographed fight, seeing the Scotsman fight in a big guy way is a nice change of pace from Jack's quick movements. The respect for each other slowly building throughout the episode is a nice payoff, as at the very end of the episode, with them offering to buy each other's drinks, ends it pretty well. Overall, this episode is a great introduction to the first recurring character of the show. The Scotsman is a great character, and he doesn't overstay his welcome. What these 22 minutes may lack in creative fight, it more than makes up for in its dynamic character pairing. Episode 12, Jack and the Gangsters. Samurai Jack gets an offer to join a 30 Styles gang of mobsters at the Blue Monkey Club, but decides to take them up on it so he can get close to Aku. The beginning of this episode is likely my favorite opening of the season. So much about it is great. The music is fantastic, the setting is unique for the show, and the fight scene is just a beautifully choreographed, with Jack taking on an army of armed robots. The fact that the singer continues as the fight goes on gives it a completely different vibe than any other fight of the season. The whole opening does the feeling of a gangster movie better than the actual gangsters in this episode. Speaking of which, they're just kind of there for most of it. The two best scenes of the episode are the two in which they don't appear, so that should tell you about how funny they are. Jack tricking the gang into thinking that he killed that old man was pretty comedic, although showing the scene twice was likely unnecessary. While the reasoning to why Aku couldn't take possession of the gem is a bit shaky, the way that Jack beats them is clever, both in-universe and continuity-wise. First off, the fight is just great. Jack's confidence, despite having no way to hurt these beings, is very in character, and the way that Earth, Wind, and Fire, which is the order the show always mentions them by the way, end up taking each other out allows the show to not mess up Jack's power level. The show has never really done a great job in describing Aku's abilities anyway. Moving on, after the second, and unfortunately last, great fight scene of the episode, we get to Jack's encounter with Aku, which is unfortunate, to say the least. The first 16 minutes of this episode are honestly pretty good, but the ending is quite possibly the most frustrating scene of any show I've ever reviewed. Once Jack and Aku started fighting, a fight that was nearly a copy of their first fight, there really was no saving this episode. I truly don't know how they could have ended this fight in a satisfying way, but trust me, they didn't either. The entire show is building up to Jack and Aku's showdown, and having this fight happen 12 episodes in, and then having it being ended by a joke character misunderstanding the situation and hitting Jack in the head is infuriating. I really wish this episode had come before Mad Jack, so that Jack could have actually gotten upset. I guess having him murder the entire gang would have been a more satisfying ending. To top off the disaster of an ending, the gang ends up keeping the gem and facing no repercussions for dooming the world for decades. I honestly don't get the point of this ending, that bad people sometimes come out on top, that good shows aren't perfect. The worst part of this is that the episode has some great moments, but I struggle to call it a good episode despite the first 80% of it being pretty good. This episode's ending seemingly exists only to annoy fans, and if that was its purpose, then I guess it succeeded. The first scene is pretty good though. Episode 13, Aku's Fairy Tales. Samurai Jack has become a popular folk hero amongst little children, so Aku decides to spread his own kind of fairy tales that put Jack in a bad light. For a show as epic as Samurai Jack, it's strange that the most comedic episode of the season is also the season finale. Obviously, the season did not have much of an arc, but I still expected it to end with some kind of fight. Anyway, the beginning of this episode has a few really funny jokes, like Phil's Jack impression actually being Phil Lamar's voice, but in general, it's just an okay scene. From this point on, Aku's humor is expected to carry the entire episode, and while there are some funny moments, it largely fails to hit the mark. The entire middle section of the episode, the title tales, all feel largely samey. The only jokes seem to be absurd reactions and Jack doing terrible things. It's kind of funny the first time, but after that, it just feels like you're watching the same thing over and over and over again. The references to other fairy tales are cool and all, but the incredibly forced Shining reference is really out of of place in the show. The animation style present throughout these vignettes just doesn't look great, especially in comparison to what we usually see in episodes. The kids not being more terrified of the interdimensional shape-shifting demon in front of them and openly mocking him doesn't really make any sense either. The last two segments of the episode are definitely the highlight, starting with the montage of stories. Ending Aku's portion of the episode was a difficult task, but doing one story with a ton of references to other fairy tales while Aku desperately tries to get the kids to like him was a great idea, and is the funniest part of Aku's tales. Once Aku disappears, the kids describe their version of a Jack story. The animation in this one is more in line with the shows, and the writers making fun of themselves to the kids ends the episode on a good note. Although it also just shows what could have been the season finale. While the concept of Aku being angry over Jack's legend is clever, its execution in this episode is too simple to fill 22 minutes. While some jokes are funny and Mako does a great job with Aku, the episode's middle section is just way too long. And that's the season. Because the season was nearly completely episodic, I'll keep this pretty short. To start, let's talk about the animation, which, while rough at times, generally looks fantastic, especially for the time. However, in an action show, choreography is arguably more important than animation quality, and luckily the show usually hits it out of the park. While the show's more typical fight scenes are great, it's the more ambitious ones that makes the show worth watching. Fights like Jack and the Archers, the opening of Jack and the Gangsters, and Jack against Aku's drones in episode 3 are all incredibly unique and are very entertaining. While some fights are definitely duds, like Jack in Space and Jack Under the Sea, the show has some absolutely stellar action scenes, usually accompanied by the show's great music. The expressions of the characters easily makes up for the general lack of dialogue in the show, and the way that they play around with aspect ratios leads to some very dynamic scenes. Jack is a great character to be following, as his commitment to justice makes him an easy character to root for. His fighting style gets a bit snagged in at points, but they mix it up pretty frequently. While Jack might not talk very much, Aku is almost always talking every time he's on screen. Generally, the protagonist is trying to avoid the powerful antagonist. However, the dynamic that is caused by Aku being the one on the defensive makes episodes like Jack and the Warrior Woman and Jack vs. Mad Jack work really well. Besides the premiere movie, Aku is the source of a lot of comedy in the show. Speaking of comedy, it's a bit hit or miss. While some jokes are fantastic, it feels like any segment or episode completely dedicated to humor usually falls flat on its face. Episodes like Jack in Space and Aku's Fairy Tales are great examples of a good joke that goes on for too long. The first season, Samurai Jack is a bit hard to summarize due to the fact that it's episodic and that I can't compare it to other seasons yet. However, what I can say is that despite a few rough spots, it's a pretty good season, and I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. My least favorite episode was Jack in Space, and my favorite episode was Jack and the Three Blind Archers. Next video will likely be Gravity Falls Season 2, and then the Samurai Jack Season 2 video shortly after. Also, while a part of me dies inside saying this, if you like the video, then please subscribe. It helps me a lot with trying to get my stuff liked by the algorithm. Also, if you want to see even more of my terrible takes on kids' cartoons, check out my Twitter. Anyway, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you for Season 2. Thanks for watching.